Hi, I'm Beth. Mary talked a little bit about me. I'm going to go in depth about my work. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really jazzed to get to know you all, to talk a little bit about my work. I know I'm going to hang out with some of y'all tomorrow. I saw some of I read all of the comics that were downstairs. So if you made those, hell yeah. And like the reading was incredible. So thank you, Mary, for having me. I taught Mary as a freshman in college, which is how long I've known Mary for, and Mary took my classes every year while they were in undergrad. Long time. Okay, so enough of that stuff. You know, it's so fun when you test everything and then it doesn't want to. The past 2 years for me have been absolutely bananas, and when my book Tender was released in March of 2024, I organized a book tour that was both physical and digital that consisted of nearly 100 events across the US and Canada. These included performing comics readings, book signings, artist talks, author conversations, magazine and podcast interviews, panel discussions, guest teaching, tabling at conventions and festivals, and live streaming at book clubs. This past fall, I even was invited and got to go to Scandinavia because of comics. Like, what in the world is even my life right now? I don't know, but we're going to try to break it down a little bit and talk about the journey of me making this book, as well as how I find myself even approaching a graphic novel, because it doesn't just pop out of your head. In my author page of Tender, I wrote that this was my debut graphic novel. And while this is my debut graphic novel with a publisher, this is by no means my first comic. I've been self-publishing and making comics since 2006. Long time. So I also attended the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for my undergrad, and that's where I started making comics. There wasn't a comics program. There were really only 2 comics classes, so I took things like print media and artist books, as well as a fiber and narrative textiles class. And the few comics classes that did exist, I took over and over and over and over again. Despite the lack of a robust comics curriculum, I met several dedicated cartoonists and clung to them for dear life. As an undergrad, I went immediately to grad school, which is what everyone tells you not to do. And my grad school was at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont, which is an all-comics grad program. CCS to me, that's me in the middle. This is on my graduation day. CCS to me was an incredible experience. I had the honor to learn from titans in the industry, including Jason Lutz, James Sturm, and Steve Bissett. And here we are on graduation day looking at my diploma, which was designed by Aaron Rainier. It has a spaceship on it, and it's pretty much the coolest master's program degree you'll ever see in your life. Every year at the school, they have a secret cartoonist design and create a diploma for everyone, and they unveil it at the commencement ceremony. So this is mine. This project, Fugue, was my thesis, and the original version is on the left, and it was 3 individual small volumes. And they were in a slipcase, and the current version is what is on the right. It's a paperback single book that's perfect bound and self-published. Fugue's a memoir about my family using music as a platform for finding what you want to do with your life. This was my first graphic novel and the longest work I had made to date. So if you're doing math, I started comics in 2006. This was in 2011. So since graduating from CCS, I've been teaching comics at the college level at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And at that part of teaching is also growing your practice. And so I want to give you a quick timeline. I'm a visual learner. I assume many of you are. Because I find it important and helpful to establish a chronological timeline of works I've created to help understand how we do this thing called comics, how we do this thing called graphic novels, how do we sustain a career and a practice. It's much easier to explain the process after it's completed. I want to be totally clear that while it's happening, no idea. Afterward, much clearer. Developing, executing, and publishing graphic novels takes a significant amount of time. My timeline, about 5 years, seems to be average. At the same time as creating longer works, I am also constantly nudging my practice forward through a consistent output of short form projects that include collaborations, experimental publications, and material explorations, as well as contributing to anthologies. So down below here, you can see all the mini comics that were created and what years. So when we put these things together, and what's important about this timeline is to highlight how the completion of short projects intersects with the steady durational progress of chipping away at a graphic novel. Okay, it's chart 1. Chart 2, I want to show a graph that categorizes a little bit of the breadth and range of the projects I'm creating. So what we're going to do here is I've created a spectrum of experimentation in form and material that on the left begins with traditional book structures, and on the right is experimental book structures. This is our x-axis, okay? Then I'm creating a spectrum of experimentation in narrative approaches, at the bottom being linear and at the top being experimental. This is our y-axis, which means the bottom left quadrant represents projects of mine that are typical comics. They have paneling, traditional binding methods. They have linear storytelling. This is what one would think of when we think of comics. The top right quadrant represents projects that have non-linear storytelling and unconventional page layouts and unusual bindings. So the most experimental in all forms. Top left quadrant represents projects that are experimental in the way that the narrative is told, but the shape of the physical book is familiar and traditional. And then the final quadrant, of course, is where the storytelling is linear, but the mode of delivery is experimental. So just to give you some range of what's going on here and what I'm going to talk about. As a creator, I have a lot of control over my work, but the moment it's put out into the world, I need to relinquish that control to the audience. Audience reactions and interactions hold valuable insight to me about how my work exists outside of myself. And throughout my practice, I'm investigating various extensions of authorship that can be seen in interactive publications. So to return to the timeline, I'm going to highlight and jump around a little bit chronologically, but these are the books that I want to talk about. The first one in this physical book form space is called Breakfast with Beth, and this is a one-page comic that is a choose-your-own adventure. The physical book form for me is a space for play and discovery, and the creation of it is important to how I'm uncovering the story, and then the reader, they're playing with it to interact with it. There are 3 moments in this book where you get to make choices and 4 possible endings that exist, and the choices made in this Choose Your Own Adventure comic change the story from one read to another, effectively authoring a new version. It's also somewhat of a game. The objective is to get breakfast, and that gamification of the story promotes somebody reading it over and over until they get the, quote, right answer. This interactive structure is known as a circle book and is an adaptation from scrapbooking. It utilizes something called a lotus fold. My collaborator, Kyle O'Connell, and I often get asked what collaboration is like. It's really difficult to describe, and we wanted to create something that helped reflect the fact that our collaboration is cyclical and multidimensional. We were interested in creating an object that reflected this shape. So we're constantly starting a new project while finishing an old project. And this type of process is echoed over and over again. This particular book is called Teamwork Makes the Dream Work, but we lovingly call it Pizza Book. And the development of this project was prompted by an invitation to participate in a performative comics reading series that originated in Chicago called Brain Frame. And this is something where, as many of you have participated in now, comics readings are a space that typically a cartoonist reading out loud the text of their comic with an image on the screen. We wanted to try something a little bit different. We wanted to see what it would be like to try to hold a collaborative meeting in front of an audience. So we each came to this event with new work on the project we'd been working on that neither of us had seen, or the other one hadn't seen yet. And we shared it with the audience and with each other and actually just reacted and had a meeting about how we create work together. We were charting kind of our language and how we were feeling throughout it on these like whiteboards behind. And for this performance, we wanted people to witness this collaboration happening in real time, and these books were an accompaniment. Frequently when we were meeting, we were enjoying pizza together, and so when we brought out a pizza box, everyone was really excited, and then we showed it was books, and they were like, oh, I guess that's cool. Comics readings, to me, are an incredibly exciting format to engage with my audience. It offers new insights and challenges in adapting my own work for a live experience. My most recent performance is an excerpt from my book Tender, which some of you will get to see tomorrow, with a custom composed audio soundscape and verbal foley. Performing comics in front of an audience allows me to regain pacing and control that's typically handed over when somebody else reads your book. I'm able to close the gap between my intention as a creator and my audience's experience as a reader. Direct engagement with an audience in front of me is the exception, not the rule, for when I'm creating work. Most often, my audience engages with my work in their own private space, and my publications act as a mediator. Who's Counting is a funny example of inverting this context. The content of this book is a collection of things I've seen or heard while tabling at comic conventions that I keep track of. Each page is a single image gag, but when you turn the wheel on the side, the cutout window changes the image slightly to make a new joke. This feat of paper engineering is called a volvelle, which is where a movable book structure that has rotating parts. By applying the volvelle to a one-page gag, each joke then becomes an eight different jokes, basically. It can be read multiple times. Each reader will have a different experience, and again, inviting a type of co-authorship. I'm obsessively on the hunt for new and interesting book bindings. I assemble mock-ups that end up tucked in my sketchbook or littered across my desk. The blank structure is a good physical manifestation of the uncertainty that comes with collecting ideas and metaphors and images for creating other work. Some of these mock-ups have been left to fester. They don't have a project yet. This project is called Monstrous, and it's a 3D hexaflexagon structure. By pressing on the outer edges, this flexible book rotates the image and transformation appears from the interior of the object. The face is presented only to be replaced with the next iteration. Monstrous, for me, embraces the never-ending cycle of new selves emerging from old selves, no matter how repulsive. This project was a collaboration with my school's artist-in-residency in their print facilities called the Service Bureau. This project was called The Fold, so they invite alumni, faculty, and students to collaborate with them on a limited edition Rezo printing. So this edition of this project is done as a flat pack, which means that people have to assemble it themselves, which I think is another fun way to encourage interaction or create fear. There's a QR code in the folder that takes you to a video tutorial that walks you through how to do this, and this project was installed outside of our school's print area. My interest in experimentation includes material exploration by using various printing methods. So I mentioned risograph as one, but I'm also concerned with the creation of how the object is reflected in the content. This book, Fallow Fields, is a process-heavy publication about the emotional labor. Each of the 12 pages for every edition is an original cyanotype created through sun exposure. And so if you're not familiar with cyanotype, linen paper is first coated with equal parts potassium ferrocyanide as well as ferric ammonium citrate. I know, super fancy. Basically two chemicals, they get mixed together in equal parts. It gets coated on the paper and left to dry in a dark room. Then I create a film positive with graphite and marker on tracing paper. I layer the chemically coated paper with the film positive outside between plexiglass and chipboard. These particular ones were left in the sun for about up to 7 minutes or so. And the linen paper then gets rinsed in cold water for 5 minutes and then hung to dry. And this process is repeated over and over and over again to create every image in this. Part of my goal with that is that when you're doing emotional labor and emotional processing, you kind of have to sit in it. and wait and just sit in it. Just like I can't control the sun, when a cloud comes, if the weather's bad, or how the prints turn out. You gotta sit in it. Okay, we're gonna turn to the timeline for a second. I wanna focus on the short experimental works that helped build up to my graphic novel Tender. So when I break down my process for students, I've noticed an important part for me is developing and self-publishing those short mini comics. And I use that as that space to play with concept, not just form, but also genre and structures that I'm considering, just to see where it'll take me. Again, in hindsight, it is really easy for me to say exactly which books showed up and started to help germinate the seeds for Tender. But at the time, you can see I made these over the course of 5 different years just because I wanted to. This is not an intentional creation of multiple things there or premeditated. For me, discovery is through the making. So this short comic, 1838 Grams, was originally published in an anthology, Irene number 3, and was later produced as a standalone mini comic. And this is the first glimmer of my work that concerns itself with the subgenres of body horror and writing an unreliable narrator. The story follows an unnamed woman who experiences paranoia and hallucinations that revolve around a strange growth in her abdomen. At the bottom of every page is a steady, pulsating throb written phonetically that acts as a background noise throughout the tale. The story shifts location and perspective each time the reader turns the page, creating a disorienting experience. The horrific things that happen are never addressed in this story, and by jumping locations and not resolving the horrors within, my intent was to make the reader flip back and forth, trying to find firm narrative ground. The disjointed narrative makes both the character and the reader question the credibility of the events that are occurring. 2 years later, I made another mini comic featuring a female protagonist, a disorienting narrative, and further explored body horror. In this book, Mirror People, I don't show the threat to the character at all and exclusively show their anxiety building in anticipation of a threat. The format for this mini comic is one where the reader needs to rotate the book in the spiral in order to read it, and not stretches time and space in a way that only comics can do. The following year, I made a mini comic called Make Do. In this mini, I was curious to see what would happen in a story where the main character gave up their fight and was resolved to make do with the horrific circumstances. Throughout this story, a nameless woman is afflicted with mysterious growth or rash that slowly begins to take over her body in a Cronenberg-esque escalation. In comics, the control an artist has over pacing of a sequence is often discussed in relation to the gridded page. How many panels, what size, the level of detail, the amount of text, all of that impacts the speed. Comics, for me, is a medium where time equals space. I'm simultaneously obsessed with the grid and exhilarated by ways to break free of its constraints. This push and pull sparked my curiosity in how to maintain control over pacing without relying on a gridded structure. So returning to a series of questions, I approached addressing them regarding the whole object rather than components on a page. Shrinking the scale of the book prompts a heightened sense of intimacy and closeness. Reducing the number of images per page focuses the reader's attention. Simplifying the illustrations to be iconographic grants a broad range of access and interpretation. And each choice leads to the culminating effect of an evenly paced reading experience where the reader is doing the heavy lifting to try to decipher this narrative. This act of mentally filling in blanks is something that I know Mary is super familiar with based on her favorite author, Scott McCloud. He calls closure. In his comics theory book, which is Mary's #1 favorite book, Understanding Comics, McCloud further identifies 6 different types of transitions from one image to another. And according to him, this book called Disquiet, these transitions would be considered non sequitur, as the images seem to have no relation to each other. Now I would argue this is actually not the case, and McCloud doesn't have a category for what I'm doing. Take that, McLeod. The images in this book ask you to hold on to them longer than their immediate vicinity. And the abstraction of them invites a type of free association wordplay that is more often seen in poetry. Like echoes in a cave, these images bounce off each other, distort, return, and fade. Disquiet opened new avenues of possibility for me in my work. I wanted to keep experimenting with this form. And initially, this work was created to address a concern of pacing and control while breaking free of the grid. Working iteratively for me prompts new questions that are discovered by thinking with my hands. In both Disquiet and this book, Impact, I wanted to push the limits of the book form by exploring how narrative is affected by material choices and that the tactile experience of the object and what that holds. These books have a single color screen print on fabric. They are machine sewn and hand embroidered and hand assembled. Similar motifs of bodily discomfort appear in both work, but my narrative approach for Impact is where the two deviate significantly. Another obsession of mine is learning about different types of narrative structures. One that continues to captivate me is called Ki-Sho Ten Ketsu. This is a 4-act story structure that's most associated with Japanese storytelling, but it can be found in classic Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese narratives as well. This structure doesn't rely on conflict, unlike typical Western story structures. The name, Ki-Sho Ten Ketsu, is a breakdown of the 4 acts that can be summarized as intro, development, twist, and conclusion. To be clear, it's not that these stories are absent of conflict, it's that their narrative structure doesn't rely on it to move the story forward. The third book in this sequence is titled Collapse. With this book, my primary concern was experimenting with color. In the previous iterations, I'm working with a single color that effectively functions like black and white. And when conceiving of this project, I was curious about how color could enhance the atmosphere and heighten the impact of the images. My approach to color is somewhere in the intersection of painting, printmaking, and film, whatever that is. There's me. Aesthetically, I'm drawn to super heavily saturated pigments that vibrate and sear your eyes. I love the pain and pleasure of that type of intensity. Procedurally, I'm interested in combining color through layering processes like CMYK and semi-transparent inks. To me, those surprises keep me on my toes while I'm working. And thematically, I'm drawn to symbolic and metaphorical applications of color that assign meaning, and that grants me comfort and control over my visual vocabulary. One of my biggest influences in color is the Italian filmmaker Dario Argento. His almost supernatural use of Technicolor and lighting makes the experience of watching his films as intense as his subject matter. The color palette for Collapse is a neon purple that was printed on top of a deep golden yellow. The contrasting purple and yellow fight for attention, causing the lines to vibrate and swell on each page. When these colors overlap, they create kind of this rusted orange-brown tone. Intentional and incidental misregistration dial those vibrations up. Because the story is told one image at a time, the reader is immersed in the brightness of each page. Something I haven't really talked about much today is that while I was making all of those previous short works, I was working collaboratively on a graphic novel called Half Asleep with my best friend Kyle O'Connell. When we could see the finish line for this 360-page beast, I started thinking about what's my next project. So I looked back to the minis I had made. Arranging these books in a sequence, that obsession of creating iterative works in the genre of horror, thinking about the body, and thinking about control becomes crystal clear. And since 2019, I started using an iPad and Apple Pencil, in addition to my physical sketchbook. I began creating several comic and illustration studies that focused on depicting tense atmospheres, extreme color combinations, and slow, meandering aspect-to-aspect panel transitions. These are some of the studies. The studies were a good way to begin to feel comfortable using this new tool and experiment with what kind of range and versatility it offered. Many of the drawings were observational and quiet reflections of environment and lighting. As I became fluent using Procreate, I found myself leaning toward texture mark making to disguise the digital process and deviate from the slickness of an artificial line. Making the switch from analog to digital felt a little bit like growing a new limb. The sudden lack of control over my hand and the marks it was making was unmooring. Immersing myself in this program by focusing on representational drawing allowed me to more thoroughly understand the advantages and disadvantages of this tool. Committing to this process and learning and failing the ins and outs of Procreate was further motivated by my students. In my average classes, nearly 3/4 of the students are working exclusively digitally. It was important to me to be able to model for them how to utilize this technology as a tool like any other thing. For me, the best way to do that is to spend intentional, committed time working digitally, like, say, 5 years making a graphic novel. My graphic novel, Tender, was published by Fantagraphics and was released. Tender is a psychological thriller with elements of body horror that comments on the societal expectations placed on women to be self-sacrificing. The story follows Carol Ann, who wanted a perfect wedding, a perfect husband, and a perfect family. Her desire to control the uncontrollable ultimately becomes her undoing. So much of this character is about her ability to exert control over everything in her life. This book is a return for me to using a gridded page layout to signify that level of precision that Carol Ann often operates with. The story of Tender is told through non-linear story structure. One thing Carol Ann doesn't have control over is time. Early in the story, I wanted to establish a rhythm for her day-to-day life and exaggerate the mundane aspects of a domestic routine. Using a 9-panel grid, I created a sequence that cycles through nesting, cleaning, and cooking across a 2-page spread. The sequence is accelerated and punctuated by Carol Ann handing her husband a sack lunch in exchange for a farewell kiss on his way to work. These panels shrink and increase as they move down the page, silently reinforcing the drudgery she begins to feel in her role as a stay-at-home wife. This 82-panel message is broadcast loud and clear to the reader that all is not well. Constricting the page to a rigid grid further reinforces how the control of the page is reflected in Carol Ann's calculated control of herself and those around her. Breaking the grid only occurs during Carol Ann's cinematic nightmares. Her interiority is a vibrant and dangerous space, densely packed with her obsessions, fixations, and how uncontrolled she is internally. The majority of the book is depicted in an eggplant purple, again functioning basically like black and white, until we get to the first nightmare. The nightmares utilize a limited 4-color palette where the colors begin to seep into Carol Ann's waking life as she unravels and loses control. At times, I'm using color to build tension in the anticipation of something horrific. At other moments, I'm intentionally manipulating the reader's anxiety around this visual vocabulary, only to pull the rug out from beneath them. To me, the color in this book serves as an audio accompaniment. Although I don't have synesthesia, in my mind, when reading this, I hear a high-pitched whine that increases and morphs into a distorted, grinding sound of metal on metal. I hope you hear that now, too. Tender taps into the deep, visceral sensations that penetrate the psyche despite it being confined to the page. Moments like this emphasize how a quiet medium can feel incredibly loud. When developing the nightmares, I returned to a similar narrative approach that I had for the 3 fabric books. I wanted the reader to experience a type of free association wordplay. In comics, this technique is called visual rhyming. Similar to verbal rhyming, visual rhyming establishes a correspondence between 2 different images. This can be applied through subject matter, composition, and a color palette. Visual rhymes can be individual images or full page layouts, and the illogical order of a sequence and repetition of similar images asks the reader to bounce around the page. So, for example, the surface of a wall crumbling to reveal pink bricks beneath, echoes the sequence of a woman pulling the skin off her face to reveal the pink musculature. As a fan of horror, I'm well versed in its shortcomings and nefarious objectification of women. In particular, body horror involving women, pregnancy, and motherhood seems to be fixated on the idea that natural processes of somebody who has a uterus are the horrific element. To me, body horror is horror at its most intimate. It uses the body as a conduit for confronting the inevitable, change. I'm interested in contemporary horror's priorities with character, not unnecessary gore, its interiority, not its spectacle. Throughout the development of Tender, I immersed myself in a variety of horror theory books from feminist and queer lenses, read prose that featured hysterical women, and watched films that skewed toward psychological thrillers. I came across a quote last year from this book called Feeding the Monster by Anna Bogatskia that reinforces an idea that I'm exploring in Tender. So, quote, "Cannibalism in literature is not really about the killing, it's about the devouring. Horror is steeped in loneliness, and cannibalism is our given metaphor for our suffocating desire for connection," end quote. Carol Ann is hungry for the perfect life that she thinks she wants, and she'll do whatever it takes to get it, resulting in her literal and inevitable self-sacrifice. The extreme lengths she goes to is echoed in the extreme vibrancy that saturates the final pages of this book. The last 2 pages of the book mirror the first 2, and only when we've arrived at the end, I wanted it to be hard to look at what she had done, literally and conceptually. After completing Tender, I began a short sequence of thread paintings that were translations from the illustrations in the book. These were created in a purgatory I had never experienced before. I had turned in my finished pages, but the book hadn't been released yet. So unlike self-publishing, when I can immediately release work to an audience, I found myself obsessing over this book that both did and did not exist. It was difficult to sit in that uncertainty without being able to engage with an audience as a sounding board. So I started sinking my obsession into repetitive motion like stitching, which helped soothe some of the itch while allowing my hands to do the thinking. I see a direct connection to me and the physical movements used to shade with a pencil or crosshatch with a nib, as well as thread painting with embroidery. The potential for this series and others like it are yet undiscovered and are not beholden to the specific genre or form that I'm working with right now. So I'm continuing to investigate this and follow my interests and see where this leads me. So this is like kind of weird new work. One of the current projects that I'm working on, I'm subverting the physical creation process I've previously used and expanding my narrative work to include picture books. As drawing technology evolves, I'm excited about the potentials and possibilities that exist in creating work that bridges physical and digital media. Returning to collaboration, my attention is fixed on material decisions. This book is tentatively titled There's a Cat in My House and is another collaboration with my BFF, Kyle. I'm building an archive of ink wash textures that are produced physically. These are made on the same scale and are done on cold pressed paper with a wide variety of brushes. Once they're dry, I scan them into my computer and I remove the white background, leaving just the marks. This project marks a new evolution in my collaboration between myself and Kyle. Previously, the way that we worked was a more traditional sense where one person writes and one person draws. But for this project, we both wrote a version and then merged them. Then we both thumbnailed a version and we merged them. And then Kyle designed all the characters and the environments and penciled about a third of the book, where I inked and finalized to make sure things stayed uniform. What this video is showing is this reductive process where I'm taking the textures and erasing to create shapes around them, essentially working into the drawing and removing aspects as one would on more charcoal-based traditional media. As we got further into this project, I ended up penciling the remaining because I'm much faster. My illustrations for this project are completed with the digital brushes and layers of low opacity textures from my archive. This new hybrid collage is a really interesting stepping stone that I can see being applied to future works. I'm curious to see how this takes shape and discover like where it sits in the body, like where it sits among the body of the rest of my work. Maybe it's beginning a new sequence of its own, very different. The last thing I want to mention is other things that I'm working on right now. I mentioned I participate in anthologies, and so things that I'm developing right now are really nebulous and much less formed, so it makes it difficult for me to share it with you. But I've completed a few smaller projects that have been included in short publications, so Bubbles magazine, as well as a new Razor Blades magazine that's out. And I'm excited to see where this takes me. In Bubbles magazine, I played with a 2-page spread that mirrored each other and itself, trying to play with the idea of somebody feeling watched or a doppelganger that shows up. So on the left-hand page, we follow a main character through just kind of an average day, and on the right-hand page, we realize that our main character is being followed by this person who starts to look like them. And in these shots, they are just sort of out of reach as the pages repeat and are mirrored in their gridded structure from the centerfold. And then this is the piece that was in Razor Blades magazine, which is inspired by a very strange conversation that happened when I was on book tour, as I got interviewed by someone, and they mentioned something called a spansel. Does anybody know what this is? It sounds like a delicious German food, but it's not. It's actually an Irish spell, and it's really messed up, and I can't stop thinking about it. It's a love spell where you as you can see, you cut a strip of skin off a corpse that is a continuous circle. There's other aspects, etc., but I thought it was funny because I was asked to do a comic strip that I then make a comic strip about a strip of skin. Anyway, okay, like I said, some of the ideas are new and nebulous and weird, and that's kind of what I'm making right now. Thank you so much for having me and listening to me talk. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.